Welcome back. Today we're diving into an entirely different section of the Bible. I say entirely different because the wisdom literature is a completely different genre within the Bible. It's different from the Pentateuch, which is those first 5 books of the Bible, and it's also different from the historical books that we discussed. Wisdom literature is meant to be taken as exactly that, wisdom. Much like the parables that Jesus used, there's poetry, there's symbolism, there's more going on than just the words on the page. These are writers that are trying to give us advice. They're philosophizing big questions of theology. They're also giving us ways to express our emotions. The wisdom literature contains one of the longest books of the Bible, Psalms, one of the most salacious books of the Bible, Song of Songs, 2 books that have inspired many songs, throw pillows, and other creative tchotchkes. That would be Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And it also has the oldest book in the Bible, the book of Job. The book of Job is the gateway to the wisdom literature, and because it sits right between the historical books and Psalms, a well-known wisdom text, many interpret this book as historical. But I'm here to tell you that a story about God and Satan making a wager about how quickly someone will curse God is not historical fact. Instead, this amazing and rousing book was meant to provide a story in which to answer the age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? It opens like most fairy tales do. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This poor man, Job, has everything that you could want. Family, children, he has cattle and plots of land. He is so blessed. And so he is kind of seen as this chosen person by God. And God goes around and says, look at Job, my faithful Job. And Satan says, well, of course, he's so faithful. Why would he ever have any reason to not be faithful? He has everything he could want. And so Satan says, but I bet if I were to mess with him, if I were to take away some of those blessings, he would pretty quickly curse your name. And so God said, try it. Test this man. You're allowed to take anything you want from him, but don't kill him. So Satan kills all of his children, burns down his land, and kills all of his cattle and all of his livestock. He has nothing but him and his wife. Then Satan gives him boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. He is so miserable. And yet he somehow still doesn't curse God, despite his wife telling him to curse God and die, which is actually a compassionate thing if you think about it, because maybe if he would do that, it would mean a quick end. God would just smite him and be done with it. So maybe this wife was actually being very compassionate. But in the end, Job says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In this way, Job is even more pious than those that may not curse God, but they just give up on God when things go wrong. Job endures the trouble from God because Job understands that God can't just be a God of blessing. We have to accept that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, and recognize that this combination doesn't always mean that we get the best in life. As Jesus says in the middle of his speech on loving our enemies, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Jesus was making the same point that Job is. We are all living in this world, receiving blessings and curses. So we must not judge others for what they do or do not do. This is all God's plan. Unfortunately, judgment is exactly what Job receives from his friends for nearly 20 chapters of his book. In these judgments, you hear the common tropes we give even today when suffering falls upon people. It has to be your fault. You weren't faithful enough. You didn't pray hard enough. God's just setting you back on the right path. This is discipline. At least the last friend, Eliphaz, takes the focus off of Job, and instead of looking at Job, just sings the praises of God and how God is above reproach. Versions of this that we hear today might be, we don't know God's plans, or God gives you only what you can handle, or everything happens for a reason. These are not helpful to a person sitting who is sick or grieving in great pain. Job remains forthright, though, even stating the faithful line, "For I know that my Redeemer lives." Many of us think of Redeemer and we think of Jesus, so Jesus lives. But Redeemer, in this sense, in the Hebrew, actually means vindicator. I know that someone is going to stand up for me. I know that someone's going to know that I'm a faithful person and I didn't deserve any of this. And guess what? God breaks on the scene. He puts the friends in their place, redeeming Job, vindicating Job. And he also responds to Job's cry, which goes something like, "What did I do, God? Tell me." But God's not nearly as compassionate as we expect him to be. Maybe we'd like him to apologize for the wager and all of this unjust suffering. But instead, he turns on Job and he says, "Who are you to question me?" Now, this might seem harsh, but this is a God that uses our intellect to comfort us in the midst of trial. A God that reminds us of our place within the greater cosmos. The wisdom that is found in the book of Job is that wisdom is not in human hands at all. It's only in God's. Humans will never understand God's ways, and God does not need to tell us the whys of life. Of course, this is frustrating, but what a mature lesson that we all at some time need to learn. We're going to see blessings pour on the righteous and on the unrighteous, and rain just the same. It's not for us to say why, or even question God in that why. Now, that's plenty of time spent on Job. The next book of wisdom literature is the grand book of Psalms. It's 150 chapters. Many ascribe it to King David, but most archaeologists and biblical scholars today would say that they were written for King David, not by King David. This is, of course, one of those tricky Hebrew words that could mean by or for. But since our Psalms were the first worship hymns of the Jewish faith, it's far more likely to believe that they were written by priests or other people working alongside the temple. Knowing the context of the Psalms will help us understand them better. Now, that word context you've heard from me before in these sessions. It's one of those biblical tools we want you to use to help you read the Bible faithfully. The book of Psalms is actually going to take all of our biblical toolkit to interpret. So here are the rest of the tools we'll be using here in the Psalms. Context, exegesis, scripture interpreting scripture, and canon within the canon. So context, as you know, is to learn what's going on in the historical period. Exegesis is to see where it is in the grander scheme of the whole narrative of God. Scripture interprets scripture is actually what we just did in Job, where we looked at how Jesus speaks the same way that Job did. We have these echoes throughout the time. And canon within a canon is actually kind of a funny term. We have canon meaning a set of authentic texts. And within those authentic texts, that is the Bible, we have some that are just always lifted up more. I'll point out all of these tools as we use them in the Psalms. Now, before you get too worried about the 150 chapters of Psalms, I won't be reading all the Psalms or even attempting to summarize them all. Instead, I'm going to do what great scholars of the Psalms do. I'm going to categorize them into 5 themes: Psalms of praise and thanksgiving, Psalms of lament, Psalms of trust, Psalms of royalty, and Psalms of wisdom. The first theme, Psalms of praise and thanksgiving, make up the majority of the Psalms in the Bible. Even those that can be found under other categories have some version of praise and thanksgiving in them. because they're meant to sing God's praises. So let's look at Psalm 100. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord is God. It is he that made us, and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, bless his name. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. Some of you may hear this and immediately put it to a tune. It's a very common psalm to sing in churches, and it has been modernized throughout the years. The beauty of these psalms is in their singability. By singing these ancient poems about God centuries after they were written, they become new for each new congregation. The author may have intended them for the one holy temple of Jerusalem, but then they were sung in exile. Then they were chanted daily in monasteries and convents. And now they're even sung today here at First Lutheran Church of Colorado Springs. Each time people sing praises and thanksgiving to God, each time they're made anew in us. In this way, the biblical tool of context isn't as important as the tools of exegesis, reading the whole psalm in its entirety, not just "for the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever," that little snippet that we know so well. Reading the whole thing allows you to see the joy of worship itself, that we want to make a joyful noise. And why? Because the Lord is good. Now let's explore a very different genre of psalm, lament. It's an important expression of emotion. I might even say as important as praise and thanksgiving. When the world has dealt us a bad hand, hopefully not as bad as Job, we need to lament. We need to be honest with God about what we're feeling. We cannot always hide behind the praise when all our heart is feeling is lament. Take Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken, but I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. This almost seems like a psalm right out of Job's mouth. The psalmist is upset, wondering when God will finally come to their aid. And yet in the end, they maintain their praise. You can hold hand in hand the challenge and the faith. However, many of you may have only heard that first verse, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? And you didn't know the rest of the psalm. And so if you didn't know the rest of the psalm, you might have guessed that the psalmist could only be mad at God. But seeing the whole psalm in its full context allows you to see the range of emotions that the psalmist felt. And we can feel that when we sing it. That is exegesis. We need not be lost in the anger with God. We can consider that, like Job, the great magnitude of God's power and work is at work in the world. We can call God out and also recognize our place. We can even be like Jesus on the cross, wondering where God is. He's quoting a psalm, you know. And yet Jesus also knew the grand plan that was in effect when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? We can be in pain and have faith that God will see us through. These psalms are written by humans just like us, with emotions and experiences just like us. The psalms help us to express our emotions to God, not suppress them. We are allowed to say anything to God. He'll still love us, and he'll still be there for us. Remember the historical books and how much we messed up? If God can be faithful to them, we can be as honest as the psalmist. Psalm 23 is probably the most well-known psalm of all. It is truly the canon within the canon. Now remember, canon is a word for the authentic works of the Bible that are claimed to be authoritative. There are some books that actually didn't make it into our Bible because they weren't considered authoritative, so those are outside the canon. Now we have a set of books that we label as canon, but within that canon, we have things like Psalm 23 that just stand higher than all the rest. And so we know them. They've come to be a part of our heart. Now, Psalm 23 is categorized as a psalm of trust, that third theme that I was talking about. And it speaks of the great care that God has for his people and the everlasting faith that we can put in God. Many of you might know this psalm by heart. But I wonder, what version do you know? I'm going to put up 3 different translations of Psalm 23, and I want you to consider, which one are you most comfortable with? Is it the New Revised Standard Version? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Is it the King James Version? He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Is it the New International Version? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. If you take a close look at these 3 different versions, you see some differences. The darkest valley versus the valley of the shadow of death, or dwelling in the house of the Lord forever versus all my whole life long. And it makes us question, why do we have different translations at all? Well, the well-known and beloved King James Version is not nearly as accurate and inerrant as we like to believe. The Bible is made up of texts that were originally written in Hebrew, the Old Testament, and in Greek, the New Testament. We have these original texts, or fragments, from archaeological digs all around the Holy Land. We can trust that our scriptures have not been tampered with through the ages. Sometimes we just need new translations that capture the way we speak today and include the newest findings in archaeology and biblical scholarship, people that know these languages. But it is true that all of our English translations are just a step away from the original. The translators of every version of the Bible are trying to do their best to capture the true meanings and understandings of words. Even Martin Luther struggled so much with this when he was translating the Bible into German. He would struggle with certain words that just couldn't be captured in the German language, or there were multiple words in the German language that could be used, and how do you capture a word that means multiple things? The King James Version, while a huge achievement at the time, was flawed due to its lack of original sources. While some sources came right from the Hebrew and Greek, they also consulted translations that had already been previously made, namely ones coming from Latin. Now imagine that a text that was originally in Greek or Hebrew is now translated into Latin, and then from Latin into English. I think you can imagine a game of telephone happening here and some very interesting interpretations coming out. After the King James Version came dozens of more translations, each toting a new version of the original. Some were more faithful to the original text, while others were more focused on making these ancient words of the original writers feel contemporary to English readers today. The New International Version is one of those translations that helps us to read the text in our own modern-day language, when staying close to the exact phrasing would only really confuse us. But if you want to study the scriptures, it's the New Revised Standard Version that you need. It's most often acclaimed by scholars and religious leaders because upon its creation, its only focus was to be faithful to the original text so that we can hear it as closely as possible as the original author intended. That is why the NRSV translation of Psalm 23, we get darkest valley rather than the valley of the shadow of death, because that is what the Hebrew actually says. In this way, the valley is not metaphorical, but entirely practical. If you're in a dark valley, you can call on God. Also, dwelling in the house of the Lord forever instead of just the rest of our days. For the original writer in Hebrew, it's to spend the rest of our days. This was a song for the temple, which means that we can only dwell in the house of the Lord, aka the temple, until we die. Nowadays, Psalm 23 has become the go-to psalm for funerals and those at the end of their life. These changes that get us closer to the original sources might feel like they're taking the power out of the psalm. Please don't let it. Once again, knowing the context of a psalm should not take away any of the glory of its wisdom. Psalm 23, just like all other psalms I have read so far, take on a new meaning for each new reader and each new singer. The wisdom literature is meant to be interpreted with our own life experiences. We're supposed to learn from it and be changed by it. There is poetic beauty in the King James Version, and it may even serve us better at the graveside. But we can't hang our entire faith on a single verse. We must recognize the multitude of voices singing praises to God in their own time and in their own language. This psalm was written for people in the temple. Today we have very different ideas of heaven and dark valleys because of what Jesus preached. Let Scripture interpret Scripture, and more importantly, let Scripture interpret our life. Now, Psalms of Royalty and Wisdom, our last two sections, are much more contextual to early Judaism and can feel unrelatable to us today. But that doesn't mean we should throw them out, because Scripture interprets Scripture. I'll say it again, Scripture interprets Scripture. Many of the royalty psalms have been used to give praise to Jesus, a man the original authors did not know, or many could even imagine. Look at Psalm 2. Do we not know of Jesus as God's begotten Son? This is a psalm to God's anointed. At the writing of it, it was likely meant to speak of an anointed king like David or Solomon, or even in hopes for the many kings of the divided kingdom before exile. But now we read it with much different eyes. When this psalm is sung by a follower of Jesus, some of these phrases take on new meaning in the believers' hearts. The psalm transcends its time and place to now speak to the people of Jesus, the King of Kings, the Prince of Peace. However, we always need to know the full psalm in its historical context and know what it's truly hoping for. A righteous king on earth, a just king. It is this very understanding of who God's anointed would be that led Jesus to be crucified on the cross, led many to not believe he was the true Messiah, for he was not an earthly king, but so much more. The wisdom psalms also echo Scripture. What does Psalm 1 make you think of? Does it make you think of Proverbs with its language of the wicked and the righteous? Exactly. These wisdom psalms were exactly that, songs to help us remember these nuggets of truth. Proverbs is a book that's often quoted, but rarely read in its entirety. If you did, you would hear the prologue that tells you exactly what is contained in the following chapters, as well as a vision of wisdom personified as a woman who cries out for people to listen. There is a constant litany of reminders to be wise and not foolish. Then in chapter 10, we reach those little couplets we know so well. Those little pieces of wisdom in poetic verse, such as train children in the right way, and when old, they will not stray. And do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day might bring. Or even iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens the wits of another. Some may be less known, and frankly confusing. Like vinegar on a wound is one who sings songs to a heavy heart. Or like a city breached without walls is one who lacks self-control. Much like the laws, we can find within these ancient words wisdom that speaks to us easily today and others that need more interpretation. Proverbs ends with a description of a capable wife, a Proverbs 31 woman. When read in its entirety, it is truly a woman who is strong, capable provider for her household, buying land and selling fine linen. She's described as strong, not only socially and maternally, but physically as well. She is the personification of a woman who has mastered these snippets of wisdom. Proverbs was meant to be read, studied, and even memorized in its entirety. Most people like to say that it's Solomon's wisdom, Solomon's Proverbs, but more likely Solomon was just a master of these pieces of wisdom. Proverbs is a treasure trove of wisdom, easily packaged in nice little couplets for us to use. Ecclesiastes is not so easily taken out into the world on throw pillows or art pieces, but it holds a similar importance in the education of the wisdom literature. It is written by someone named Kohelet, which is translated to be teacher or preacher in Hebrew. It opens with the famous line, "Vanity of vanities," says the teacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. In there is the root of the whole book. All is hevel. Hevel is the translation of vanities. Both the things we beloved so much that they become idols, and the anxieties we give ourselves on a daily basis. It's all hevel. Hevel is normally translated into English as vanities, but a closer idea for most scholars is vapor. Something easily here one minute and gone the next. Fleeting. Vanity does capture that somewhat, but not quite. So I always like to go back to the Hebrew, hevel. It has some weight to it. Our teacher in this book tells us that we must live in the moment. For the author and his audience, this is because, once again, they didn't have a vision of heaven like we do today. They believed that our temporary life was all there is, so we must enjoy it. Even though we now believe in heaven, we can still learn from this wisdom. There are the beautiful words of chapter 3, "For everything there is a season." Most of you might think this type of thinking would lead to agnostic or even atheist beliefs, but never does the teacher say that that's what we're supposed to do, or that we're supposed to do whatever we wish. Instead, we're simply to enjoy the good and the bad. We are to enjoy all that God has granted us. When we live for the moment and not for what comes next, we fully appreciate the gift of life that God has given us. An atheist would try to find meaning in the moments, but for us as Christians and for this teacher as a Jewish believer, the moments have meaning because of the Creator that gave them to us. There's a time for everything, and everything has its time. Let's recognize the holy in this every day. Song of Songs is the next book in wisdom literature, and it is the most controversial. The book used to be hidden away, literally, from young men's eyes and condemned for centuries. But at the same time, it is beloved and has become a righteous text that has even overcame its scandalous beginnings. Most biblical scholars believe that the Song of Psalms, though referencing the daughters of Jerusalem and King Solomon, was originally just a love story between two people. However, upon further readings and many commentaries from early church fathers, they really loved this book, the meaning and the symbolism behind this tryst in the garden between lovers becomes a love story between God and humankind. Sometimes even more specifically, God and the church. Those interpreters, commentators made this story change and become anew. Much like those psalms that speak to each of us on an individual level, this love story spoke something fresh to the early religious believers. However, if you prefer to read the Psalms over the Song of Songs, that's okay. That is another understanding of a canon within a canon. Some books are just more important for us than others, and that's okay. Our final book of wisdom, Lamentations, brings us right back to where we left off in Jewish history, the exile. The first 4 chapters describe life under the Babylonian siege. The 5th chapter reflects what happened immediately after the fall of Jerusalem. Some of you might be thinking, just based on this brief description, why Lamentations would be considered part of the wisdom literature at all. Some Bibles even place it within the prophets because of its historical place in the exile. But it's seen as wisdom because even though we can place it within its historical context quite easily, the way it's written in poetic verse and the context that it addresses, what the fall of Jerusalem can mean for the spiritual well-being of the Israelites, speaks to something much deeper than historical retellings or even prophetic witness. It is a book that sits betwixt and between, hard to categorize, but it resembles most closely the lament psalms. In the same way that the psalms capture our desire for God's action and comfort, so the lament psalms give us words to recite in times of trial. Here's a quote from Lamentations. "The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." Just a few verses later, the author says, "For the Lord will not reject forever." There is hope in God's power and salvation. These verses you may have heard out of context, and how much stronger do they feel now that you know that they were written by the author in the midst of a siege, knowing that their sins have brought them here and that their city is about to fall. But their faith endures in the God that is above human wars. The author pleads for mercy, but also recognizes their own actions that led to this exile. Lamentations has a special meaning when its poetic and psalm-like words are seated within their historical context. Not only can we see how the same statements can prove timeless, the words of Lamentations speaking to those that suffer from their own mistakes today, but also we know the rest of the story. We know that they do make it out of exile. We know that the ultimate salvation comes in the form of Jesus Christ. The Bible is a collection of many different works, but when seen together, we see the grand picture of God's journey with his people. God is constant and steadfast, giver of wisdom and everlasting love. Now, before I let you go today, I want to recognize that we are at the halfway point of our Bible class. So it's fitting time to review the tools of interpretation that we've been using to read our sacred text responsively and faithfully, and avoid the mistakes that lead to misusing the Bible. So here are the tools that we've learned so far. Canon within a canon. This is the recognition that not all Bible books or texts are equal. Some are more important than others. Psalm 23 stands tall in the book of Psalms. And the book of Psalms stands tall rather than the Song of Songs, for it helps our faith more. This is why we read the Gospels for every worship service and often preach from the Gospels. They are the most important of all scriptures and stand with authority over all the rest of the Bible. Scripture interprets scripture. When we come upon a difficult scripture, we can turn to the other scriptures to help us understand. These are also those echoes that I've been mentioning throughout the Bible that allow us to see the grand scheme of God's plan for his creation. Context. This is what our English teachers taught us. Instead of just pulling a verse out and letting it stand on its own, we discover its meaning by looking how it fits in the flow of the passage, the entire book, and in its historical setting. Exegesis. This is a summary of all the tools meant to ensure that we are letting the scriptures tell us what they mean, rather than twisting them to mean what we want them to mean.